So I finished using pen for my mark making, and I'm ready to move on to actually do the final watercolor step. Now I taped down just a little bit of the edges, just the thinnest sliver, because whatever I tape down will preserve whatever ink is underneath it, whatever line work I have, but my watercolor will not cover those areas up. So it might seem a little strange or awkward that my original drawing was a little bit wider than the area that I will be coloring. That will probably get covered up with a mat board, or if it bugs me, I can trim that off with an X-Acto blade or a scissors. But it's important to tape this down because if your paper gets wet, it will start buckling, which will make it so that the watercolors pool in the areas that sink inward. I'm going to need my water cup. I'm going to need a paper towel. I'm going to need a couple different sized watercolor brushes, not to be confused with the other acrylic brushes, and a watercolor palette. Sometimes these watercolor palettes have the paints flake right out of whatever paint well that they dried in. If that happens, don't throw that away. See if you can get it wet and stick it back down in there. With color mixing, if I want to paint the sky to be perfectly blue, it's going to be a very saturated color. If I want to paint the buildings red, it's also going to be a very saturated color. If you don't want it to be as saturated, you can mix a earth tone in with that color, like a yellow ochre or your brown colors. Or if you get into a little bit of color theory, you can mix the opposite color on the color wheel as that color. So if I wanted those buildings to be red, I could mix a little bit of green in there to mute that color down. So I'm gonna start with the sky, I think. And in order to properly paint, I need to mix my color on my palette first. And I don't want to just wet my paintbrush and go right to the color I want and then paint right on my paper. I want to make a puddle of that color. So if I'm going to do the sky, I might want to get my paintbrush wet. It's going to absorb the water like a sponge and go over to the color that I want to paint with. And the more I scrub with my paintbrush, the more pigment it picks up and the darker, or more saturated, I should say, that puddle will be. And if I need more water because I need more paint, I have to paint a bigger area, I can always dip my paintbrush back in my water cup to pick that up. Now I need to switch colors because I want to do sort of like a sunset color or sunset effect in the sky. So I need to rinse my paintbrush, make sure that it's clean, and go to the color that I want to do for the sky. And again, the more I scrub with that paintbrush, the more pigment it picks up. And so I've effectively made my puddles of watercolor. And there's several painting techniques you can incorporate. One of them is just simple color blending. And that can be done by painting one color on part of your design. And I think I'm going to overlap my trees in the background. I want to give them a hazy effect so that it looks like it's just as warm as the rest of the sky. When I do this, I need to start on one end and work my way systematically over. And I need to kind of work fast because I don't want this to dry too quickly. Sometimes I like to juggle paintbrushes and I jump to another paintbrush if I need it. Keep both paintbrushes handy. So I've brought my yellow over to the lower part of this. And again, if I want to do like a gradient for the sky, I can't blend colors unless both colors are wet. So if I want to go in with a blue, that's only going to work if I work quick enough and I'm able to make those two colors touch, and they will do a lot of blending on their own, actually. And for this project, you are mostly working with thin washes. You don't want your colors to be too bright or saturated, otherwise they'll overpower the work you did with your pen. You just want this to be kind of an accent color. All watercolors will dry to be more light than you think they will. So if you think you went too dark, there's a chance it might lighten itself up. And when I'm trying to blend it, I just brought that upper color and one paintbrush stroke at a time brought it down to the yellow. And if I'm worried that it's overpowering the yellow, I stop with my blue. Maybe I wash that brush, or maybe I switch paintbrushes to my yellow paintbrush. And if you feel like, uh-oh, maybe this might be a little streaky, just let it dry because it might start blending on its own. You also might want to babysit it a little because depending on what kind of paper you're using, it might dry to be more uneven than you want it to be. That's how I color blend one color into another. Another technique you can do is called wet on wet, and it's a good way to keep your colors contained while keeping your washes light. So first I'm going to mix my color. And in order to do wet on wet, I need to paint water on the entire surface of whatever I'm going to paint first. I need to wet that surface. But since I just painted the sky, it would be a really bad idea to paint the part of my landscape that is touching that sky. Because if I do, just like the blending that happened in the sky, whatever maybe red I paint this building will start bleeding into the sky, and I don't want that. So I need to let some colors dry before I am able to do that. And some help in if you make a mistake, if you paint outside the lines a little bit, there are some ways you can fix that. And one way is with a paper towel. So I have a smaller second paper towel ready. And sometimes if it's still fresh, I just blot that area with a paper towel and it lifts right off. If it's a little too far gone, it's a little too dry, get a wet but clean paintbrush and just gently scrub at that area. And it's going to act a little bit like what a sponge would do if you spilled something on a table. It's going to scrub that right off of the surface so that we can lift it off. This is something that you should do with caution, because if it's really dried on there, there may not be very much scrubbing you can do with your paintbrush because it may be too dry. And you might just distress or tear up parts of your paper in an attempt to fix those areas. So I actually stepped away for a short period of time to let my sky dry, because if I, again, paint something like my buildings right next to that sky, those colors are going to start blending into each other. So don't paint two different colored things next to each other unless you want them to blend. For wet on wet, I'm actually going to mix my color. And to mute that color down, because that's so bright, I'm going to introduce some of my earth tones. Yellow ochre is good at muting some things down in kind of a yellowy sort of way, or you could use the browns. And for wet on wet to work, you need to get your area wet like this. And you need to pay very close attention to where the edge of whatever water you are painting. Because if I don't want my trees to get painted that color, I need to be very careful to not get those areas wet. And you need to work quick, because if your water gets absorbed by the paper too quickly, then wet on wet does not work. And if your paintbrush isn't big enough to do that, you can always use maybe a small sponge or a slightly wet paper towel, whatever you can do to quickly cover that area. And for wet on wet to work, you just get whatever puddle of color you made and just paint right on there. This is going to get you a lighter color because there's already water on that paper, but it will ensure that you paint inside those lines, and it will ensure that your layers of color are very even. So here is another helpful tip. There's something called lift off, which is when you strategically use a paper towel or even a clean and dry paintbrush, and you place it on whatever area you want to lighten up, and the clean but dry paintbrush, or mostly dry, should absorb that color so that it creates a highlight, or the paper towel just blots it right up. And even after you think that it dries, for some paper, if you re-wet that paper and then blot it up, that lift off can still happen. If you want to ever soften an edge of something, you can just go in with a wet paintbrush, and even if you think, that's drying to be too dark of a line, you can go in and soften that with just a clean wet paintbrush and just go run over that seam, and it will smooth that out for you. And you can even do that after, depending on the paper you have, if you get the area wet, it kind of, depending on the paper, reawakens that. And another thing with this watercolor is you can build up multiple layers. So right now this layer is still wet and I need to wait for it to dry. But once it dries, I can go on top of it with a layer number 2, and it will start building up darker and maybe more saturated layers so that I can make some of these shadows seem more dark, because this right here is not as dark as I think it could be. It can also help us kind of create more control over some very detailed areas, because right now there isn't a lot of control. The water blends where it wants to, and it might be a little bit tough to give up a little bit of that control and see that there are some areas that didn't really turn out how you wanted them to. And that's why we're mostly working with really light washes, so we don't have to worry too much about those details turning out how we don't want them to, because we're just adding a splash of color. But you can build up multiple layers if you want more details in maybe a focal point here or in the trees. So this is my final painting. Good luck with your 1 point perspective ink and watercolor paintings.